For 18 years, I thought that I was pretty smart. But then things started to happen that made me realize that I'm actually a fool. In this video, I'm going to talk about how I came to this realization, as well as how this realization made me see the genius in other people, and thereby allow me to learn from other people at an accelerated rate. Okay, so the first time I was truly humbled in my smartness was in university, in philosophy classes. So in some of these philosophy classes that I took, we'd be presented with questions. And I recognized the difficulty of these questions, but more often than not, I would be able to come up with decent answers to these questions after a long time of thinking. And I'd be so excited, ready to present my answers to these 1,000-year-old questions that nobody else could solve. But very quickly, I learned that as soon as I would present my answers, I would be faced with the reality that there were about 1 million other thinkers in history who came up with similar or identical answers as I had. And I would also realize that there were about 1 million other thinkers who actually showed how those answers were wrong. And so they came up with better answers. But then there would then again be another 1 million thinkers who showed how even these better answers were actually flawed in so many other ways. And this kept happening. And it was kind of disturbing at first. But this really was the beginning of me realizing more and more how much I really don't know. With this experience, I had no choice but to be a little bit more open-minded now in life in general. And this open-mindedness allowed me to notice some further things that made me realize how even less than that I know. For example, I realized how you really cannot justify any ethical claim or any moral claim. There was no way I could ultimately provide justification for a moral claim. Let's take the claim of you shall not punch an innocent person. There's no way by which you can truly justify to a person for them not to commit that act. Why should they not selfishly do that? There's nothing we can ultimately justify it with from a secular point of view. The best we can do is say something like, well, it feels better if you don't. So this was one thing that made me really see how, okay, I thought that this was pretty simple, pretty obvious, pretty common sense. But if I cannot justify something as basic as this, how can I justify more complicated things, more subjective things? Another example for me came from an unexpected source. So the most objective thing that we as humans have is science. But I learned that every single scientific theory that has ever existed has undergone some sort of revision, whether a minor revision or a revolutionary revision. And so this really got to the point of there existing no absolute objectivity, as haunting as that sounds. So even the most objective thing that we have, science, is always changing, always progressing. In fact, that is what makes science unique. That is why science is able to progress like no other field, because it is always open to change, because it always knows that there's no such thing as absolute objectivity. Everything, no matter how objective it seems, necessarily depends on background assumptions. Some things rely on more background assumptions, some things less, but everything does. So here I was, and I thought, okay, if the most objective thing that we have can never be absolutely objective, what hope is there for me? A further example that made me realize my ignorance even more was the notion that these background assumptions that apply to science, they also apply to my very brain or my very mind. My mind works on background assumptions. And this is pretty clear if we look at the fact that, for example, there are worldwide disagreements about practically every topic. Or if we look at how there are endless cognitive biases that we have. Or even if we get as primitive as possible, if we compare our brains or our minds to those of other animals, well, there are some colors that we see and other animals cannot see, or vice versa. There are sounds that we hear and other animals cannot hear, or vice versa. If you blow a dog whistle, the typical dog hears something the typical human does not. So all of this goes to show that there's no absolute truth out there, whatever out there means. There's no such thing as passive, objective perception. Even perception itself is active, and everything has an element of subjectivity to it. So if I can see my ignorance in something as simple as hearing a noise, how can I not see my ignorance in something like if abortion is right or wrong, and debating somebody endlessly on that with a powerful conviction? And so with every disturbing realization, I eventually came to see what the ancient Greek philosopher Socrates meant with his famous quote that says, "There's only one thing I know, and that's that I know nothing." And this instilled me with a type of radical open-mindedness that allowed me to pay more attention to other people and notice that there's genius in everybody. There's wisdom in everybody. If I just pay attention, notice, and listen. Now, I know that a lot of people laugh at that idea, but I think these people are simply drowned in their arrogant intellect. They are simply deriving pleasure from underestimating other people's brains. And it is simpler, right? If we assume that I know more than almost everybody in my own way, it's simpler. It makes life so much simpler, boosts your ego. So many benefits come from that. But it's simply not true. And so I realized that it doesn't matter who it is, there's at least one thing that they could know that I don't know concerning any topic. And so how could I not pay attention properly and listen, genuinely listen, and be looking to learn for something? Even if it's like the least possible thing somebody could offer me is viewing something from a different perspective. But even that in itself comes with so much to learn from. But that's the very least that they can offer. If they actually speak, if we don't shut them down, they're not shy, and they're able to articulate themselves, there's wisdom, equal wisdom in everybody. And this actually reminds me of how they've even done a study about this, but it's even without the study, I think it's clear if you think about the personal people in your own lives. There is wisdom variability. There's more wisdom variability within a person than between people. What that means is that there's not as much of a difference in wisdom between two people as there is between the same person at different times in their life. So to better explain this, you can think of a person in your life who you might consider as quite wise. I'm sure you can think of many examples where that same person has not acted in a wise manner. And same thing the other way around. You think of somebody who you don't really consider as a wise person in your own personal life. There are moments where they've acted quite wise. If you honestly reflect upon this, and even with yourself, in some situations you're acting way wiser than in other situations. So everybody has the potential for wisdom. It's just that other factors come into play as to whether you express it or not, or whether you see it in other people or you choose not to see it. if you give them a chance or you don't. Now, an unexpected huge benefit that I gained from all of this was that because I listened so much to other people, what they have to say, or to other sources, I started to learn at such a rapid pace. My rate of learning became so much more accelerated than it used to be up until that point. I would start to learn from people from places where most people would not learn from, because they would assume that there's nothing to be learned from there. This made me like a learning sponge, close to a child, the way a child learns more rapidly than a full-grown human because they've got a type of open-mindedness. It was something like that. And, you know, I'm at the point where even if I'm arguing with my enemy and they make their worst argument, my first instinct is actually to find the positives, the strengths in my enemy's worst argument, to see what I can learn from there. If you enjoy discussions like these for the purpose of practical personal growth, then I do have a free online community. The link is in the description. It's something that I have never seen anywhere online before. It's a place where we can get together on a group call and exchange ideas with each other, whether we agree, disagree. We can talk about literally anything.